Long before the world entered its current era of uncertainty, one woman made a prediction that would echo far beyond her lifetime. Back in 2008, when most people were focused on economic worries and everyday life, Sylvia Browne issued a warning about something she believed would strike humanity in the year 2026. At the time, her words barely raised an eyebrow. But today, that prediction has resurfaced with a level of intensity many find unsettling. Browne didn't describe a minor shift or a passing crisis. She spoke of a global disruption, an event she claimed would alter daily life in a way people could hardly imagine. And what makes her statement even more disturbing is this: several of the predictions she made before her death have already aligned with real-world events in ways that continue to surprise both believers and skeptics. To understand why so many people are paying attention, you have to understand who Sylvia Browne was. She wasn't viewed simply as another fortune teller on television. For millions across the United States and around the world, she became a voice for the questions science and religion often leave unanswered. Her calm, matter-of-fact delivery made her feel less like an entertainer and more like a messenger, someone who could put words to the anxieties people carried but rarely spoke out loud. Raised in a Catholic family in the 1930s, Browne claimed she had spiritual experiences from childhood, visions, voices, and what she called guidance from a spiritual being she named Francine. Whether people believed her or not, she built a career that lasted decades. She appeared everywhere: national talk shows, radio programs, public conferences, and dozens of best-selling books. Her audience wasn't limited to the curious. Many followers were individuals grieving, searching, or feeling abandoned by conventional institutions. Even critics admitted she had a remarkable ability to tap into human emotion. Yet what keeps her legacy alive today isn't her personality or even her spiritual teachings. What continues to revive her name, especially in moments of global anxiety, are the predictions that seem to mirror real events long after she wrote them. The most famous example is in her 2008 book, End of Days, where she described a worldwide respiratory illness emerging in 2020. The details, its sudden appearance, its impact on the lungs, and the global disruption eerily matched the pandemic that unfolded more than a decade later. When COVID-19 struck, people began digging through her old writings. News outlets revisited her books. Social media exploded with screenshots of her predictions. Some dismissed the parallels as coincidence or vague language. Others saw the timing and the specificity as too precise to ignore. But there was one part many people overlooked: the part about what happens next. According to Browne, the illness wouldn't be a one-time event. She warned that a similar crisis would reappear 10 years later, bringing another wave of fear and instability. And as the world moves toward 2026, that prediction has started to capture global attention. Whether her words were intuition, coincidence, or something more mysterious, they have pushed many to reopen her writings and examine what else she believed was coming. And for those who believe, God reveals signs through unusual messengers. Her predictions have become a topic of renewed fascination. For many people, Sylvia Browne's words offered an odd kind of reassurance, almost as if she were reminding the world that nothing truly catches God, fate, or the universe off guard, even when life feels chaotic. Her predictions made some believe there might be a storyline unfolding behind the scenes. Yet that same reassurance came with a shadow attached. If she had accurately described an event in 2020, what else in her work might be pointing towards something real? And what do we do with the warning she attached to 2026? The closer we move toward that year, the more her old writings seem to rise back into public conversation. When her 2008 prediction about a global respiratory illness resurfaced during the pandemic, it triggered a wave of emotions: relief for some, fear for others, and skepticism from those who believed it was all coincidence. Even people who had never looked twice at her books suddenly found themselves combing through her older chapters, trying to understand how she got so many details so close to reality. This sparked a debate that never fully went away. Was Sylvia Browne simply lucky? Or was she tapping into something beyond normal perception? Or, perhaps even more unsettling, were people seeing patterns because they were desperate for answers? Human beings don't like uncertainty. When life becomes confusing or painful, the mind looks for meaning, and sometimes it finds it in unusual places. But Sylvia's predictions stood out because they were not vague or exaggerated. She didn't write her books like a doomsday prophet trying to scare the world. Her tone was straightforward, almost clinical. as if she were documenting something she had already seen. And that's what leaves so many people stuck between belief and doubt. Do we take her 2026 predictions seriously, or are we letting fear shape our imagination? Blind belief can push people into panic. Blind disbelief can leave us unprepared. Wisdom is somewhere in the middle, paying attention without surrendering to fear, staying grounded without closing our eyes. One thing is clear, Sylvia Browne didn't treat 2020 as an isolated moment. She believed the entire decade of the 2020s would mark a deep turning point for humanity. Not a sudden explosion of disaster, but a slow, creeping shift that affects how people think, feel, and relate to one another. A spiritual fog settling over the world, invisible yet powerful. According to her, the true danger of this decade wouldn't be physical destruction. No asteroid, no nuclear fire, no global collapse. The danger would be subtle, confusion, division, and a growing inability to tell truth from illusion. She wrote that technology would race ahead faster than society could ethically or emotionally adapt. Institutions people once trusted would begin to feel hollow. Families would sit together under the same roof yet feel worlds apart. People would feel surrounded, yet deeply alone. Busy, yet emotionally exhausted. Connected, yet spiritually empty. And she claimed this emotional unraveling wouldn't come from one major event, but from countless smaller fractures building quietly over time. A world losing its direction, not through violence but through slow erosion. The result, she warned, would be a decade-long testing ground, something preparing humanity for a specific moment she pinpointed, the year 2026. Out of all her predictions, this one is the most unsettling. She didn't describe earthquakes or floods or cities falling into the sea. She described something far more intimate, the collapse happening inside the human heart. Browne wrote that 2026 would mark a peak in spiritual crisis, a moment when millions of people would wake up feeling as though the meaning had drained out of their lives. A strange heaviness, spreading quietly, without any obvious source. People would go through their daily routines, working, shopping, scrolling, living, but feel as if something essential had gone missing. Not depression in the medical sense, not anxiety from stress, but a global numbness, a collective feeling of being disconnected from purpose. Even more disturbing was her claim that most people wouldn't recognize it immediately. Life on the surface would look normal. Technology would keep advancing. Governments would continue functioning. The world would appear calm. Yet beneath that calm, something deeper would be breaking. Families drifting apart without arguments. Communities losing their sense of unity. Individuals questioning why they wake up each morning and struggling to find an answer. She described 2026 as a year of eerie stillness. No dramatic headlines, no catastrophic explosions, just a quiet unraveling of the human soul. For her, this was humanity's greatest test, an invisible struggle that couldn't be fought with force, science, or politics. And this brings us to the part of her warning that disturbs people most. Sylvia Browne insisted the real threat of 2026 wouldn't be war, plague, or natural disaster. It would be something without shape or sound, something that moves like smoke through societies, unnoticed until it has already settled. A force that doesn't break buildings, but breaks spirits. That doesn't topple nations, but hollows out the people living inside them. A disconnection so quiet, people might not realize it's happening until they feel completely empty. People, Sylvia said, wouldn't suddenly collapse into chaos. The change would creep in quietly, so slowly that most wouldn't notice it until something inside them felt missing. Day by day, life would feel less familiar. Emotions that once came naturally would begin fading. Joy would feel distant, fear would rise without explanation, and instead of rebelling, many would simply stop caring, not because they were cold, but because they were exhausted. She described it as if the human heart were a lantern losing its flame, not extinguished at once, but dimmed little by little. This unraveling wouldn't arrive with headlines or emergency alerts. It would appear in subtle, intimate ways. A mother who can't feel the warmth she used to have for her children. A man staring into the mirror, unable to recognize the person looking back. A neighbor who stops interacting in the real world and vanishes behind screens. People would be surrounded by others, yet sink into isolation, even in a crowded room. Sylvia believed this emotional fog would come from several forces mixing together: spiritual neglect, emotional burnout, and a growing loss of purpose. Technology, she wrote, would make it worse, not because it is evil, but because it distracts the soul long enough that people forget to listen to their own inner voice. That, she warned, would be humanity's most dangerous moment, not the events happening outside, but the emptiness forming within. But Sylvia didn't stop with the human heart. She also claimed the natural world would begin reflecting that same spiritual imbalance. She wrote about strange environmental changes, heat waves, chaotic weather, and shifts science would struggle to explain. To her, these weren't simply effects of climate change. They were signals, echoes of something deeper. She spoke of a world behaving as if confused, rain falling in deserts, storms appearing without pattern, winds carrying an energy that made people uneasy without knowing why. These were not random, she insisted. They were warnings, signs that the connection between the physical and spiritual realms was weakening. And although scientists would offer explanations, she believed their answers would feel incomplete, because beneath the data and measurements, the world itself was trying to communicate. According to her, nature responds to the spiritual condition of humanity, and when the soul of the world is sick, creation begins to tremble. As 2026 approaches, she said people would feel it, not just through headlines, but deep in their bones. Animals acting strangely, plants wilting without reason, seasons slipping out of rhythm. To most, these would seem like isolated incidents, but to those familiar with her writings, they would look like pieces of a larger and more troubling pattern. One of Sylvia's most powerful warnings concerned a growing clash, not between nations or religions, but between faith and technology. She foresaw a world where human beings become so reliant on machines and AI that they slowly lose connection with their inner life, their conscience, and with God himself. She wasn't condemning technology, she understood its benefits, but she feared a future where machines guide human behavior more than prayer, intuition, or wisdom. A time when people turned to algorithms for answers that once belonged to the soul. She believed 2026 would be the peak of this tension. People would face a choice, not between religion and progress, but between living with a soul or living without one. A world where speed replaces silence, information overcrowds wisdom, and artificial intelligence becomes a substitute for conscience. In that new reality, she said, many would feel lost while having access to everything: entertainment, medicine, information, overflowing, yet spiritually empty, because what people truly needed couldn't be downloaded or streamed. It could only be found within. This, she said, would be a quiet war, a personal battle every individual would have to face alone. Sylvia also envisioned a transformation of cities themselves. She warned that by 2026, many cities would no longer feel like places of freedom, but subtle prisons disguised behind convenience. Not bars or guards, something more sophisticated. A new structure of constant monitoring woven into everyday life. Cameras on every corner, devices in every home, systems tracking movement, habits, and emotion, all done in the name of safety, progress, and efficiency. No one would force obedience. People would simply grow accustomed to it, comfortable, passive, trusting the system because it felt easier than questioning it. She warned this wouldn't arrive with violence or dictatorship. It would creep in gently through technology, fear, and convenience. And without realizing it, people would censor their own thoughts, silence their own discomfort, and forget what real freedom once felt like. Cities would become too perfect, clean, controlled, emotionless. Human connection would fade, spiritual life would suffocate, and those who tried to live differently, who clung to intuition, faith, or independence, would be quietly pushed to the margins. A cage with no bars, she called it. And by 2026, many wouldn't even remember that it was a cage. But one of her most unsettling warnings wasn't about technology or nature. It was about leadership. Sylvia said that as the world slips deeper into confusion, people would turn to leaders for clarity. Political leaders, scientific authorities, even spiritual voices. But instead of truth, they would receive polished speeches, words without soul. She foresaw a time when leaders would stand on stages but offer no real guidance. Answers would become vague, warnings would come too late, and behind closed doors, decisions would be made without transparency or compassion. This wasn't the collapse of leadership, it was the collapse of trust. And when trust shatters, she warned, people begin doubting institutions, systems, and eventually, even their own sense of right and wrong. This erosion wouldn't happen overnight. It would drip slowly, like water leaking through a ceiling until one day the whole structure caves in. Fear would rise louder than truth, confusion louder than wisdom. And once fear rules the mind, people stop thinking, they simply follow. She believed that 2026 would represent not just pressure from outside, but a fracture within society itself. And then came one of her most mysterious predictions, a silent moment that would stop the world. She never described it with numbers or scientific detail, only that it would arrive suddenly, without warning. And it would not be a physical catastrophe. It would be something that breaks people's sense of reality. A moment so strange that governments would scramble for explanations. Scientists would argue. Theories would spread like wildfire. But none would fully make sense. Confusion first, fear next, answers much later. This single mysterious event, she said, would accelerate everything. The emotional collapse, the disconnection, the spiritual emptiness. It would all intensify after this moment. For some, it would lead to withdrawal. For others, panic. And for a few, a desperate search for truth. But Sylvia insisted this would not be the end. It would be the turning point, the moment when the world no longer feels like the world we knew. Yet within all her warnings, Sylvia Browne also saw something beautiful emerging. She believed that as darkness grows heavier, something sacred begins to awaken. Beneath all the confusion and emotional exhaustion, the human soul begins to search for what truly matters. A return to faith, a return to family, a return to the values that once gave life meaning. She saw millions of quiet spiritual awakenings, not in churches filled with crowds, but in individual hearts. People praying again after years of silence. Families reconnecting after long separation. Communities forming not around politics, but around compassion and belief. This transformation wouldn't be easy. Many would resist. But eventually, she believed, people would remember who they are, not just citizens or consumers, but souls created with purpose. For Sylvia, 2026 was ultimately not about destruction, but rebirth, a painful cleansing, a spiritual fire through which something sacred would emerge. And then came her most cryptic prophecy, a sign in the sky. She never explained it scientifically. She didn't describe a comet, a ship, a weather anomaly, or a miracle. She simply said it would be something seen by all, understood by few, but felt by everyone. Not an invasion, not a disaster, a revelation. Something that challenges the human understanding of reality. Something that makes the world realize it is not alone, never has been. This sign would divide humanity not by borders, but by belief. Some would open their hearts, others would cling to denial. But for the faithful, she said, it would bring peace. The peace of knowing that nothing happening is random. It would be God's reminder you are not forgotten. And after every warning, every moment of fear, Sylvia ended her prophecy with one message, hope, because in her eyes, faith was the one place untouched by the storms of 2026. Not institutional religion, but deep, personal trust in God, in truth, and in the eternal value of the human soul. She believed that no government, no technology, no system would save humanity. What would endure were the people who held on to prayer, compassion, forgiveness, and love. Those who carried light when the world felt dark. Those who remembered who they were. Those who refused to let their souls grow silent. For Sylvia Browne, faith was not an escape. It was the anchor. And she believed that in the storm of 2026, the soul anchored in faith will not fall. It will rise.